Welcome to Big City, Small Town, the weekly podcast all about San Antonio and the people who make it go and grow. I'm your host, Bob Rivard. This week's guest is, well, not really exactly a guest. Meet Cory Ames, the new producer of our podcast and himself the host of his own San Antonio-centric podcast, Ensemble Texas. Cory and his family, who we'll hear more about shortly, have lived in San Antonio since moving here in 2017 from Austin. And if you, like Cory, are a relative newcomer to the city, the Ensemble Texas podcast is a great way of learning more about San Antonio and everything happening here. And we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But first, I want to thank Ashley Bird and Maura Bobbitt with Blooming with Birdie for their work here through our first 2 years of the podcast. Maura, who's in the studio with us today, will continue as a member of the in-studio production team, along with Erica Rempel, who is here and continues providing video and social media services, and Alfie De La Garza with Sound Crane Studio, who's not here, but who's our wonderful audio engineer and sound editor. But overseeing it all, helping me with guest bookings and taking the podcast to the next level will be Cory Ames. So Cory, welcome. Before we start, I want to thank our sponsors in the new year for making our work possible here, Weston Urban and Geekdom. We record, of course, in the Geekdom podcast studio, located on the third floor of the historic Rand building on East Houston Street. Guests who have never been to the Rand building come here and always marvel at its unique blend of history and sort of tech modernity. This building opened in the early years of the 20th century as the Wolf and Marks department store, the city's first multi-story department store. That closed in 1965. It became a building owned by Frost Bank, and then Graham Weston bought it in 2013 and completely renovated it and modernized it and gave Geekdom a permanent home, and that's where we are. So a little bit of history there for everybody. Here we are today. Cory, welcome to Big City, Small Town. It's a new year, and with your arrival now as our new producer, I'm very bullish about 2025. It's going to be a newsy year in one of the fastest growing cities in the country, and we'll be expanding the podcast to meet the moment. But first, let's introduce Cory to our audience. This is where I get to ask you to tell your life story in 5 minutes or less.
All right. Well, first off, Bob, thank you so much for having me here. And as well, it's a real pleasure to be joining the Big City Small Town team. So likewise, I share the excitement for this new year. But in short, the life story in 5 minutes, I was born in Spokane, Washington, but ultimately came to Texas by way of Seattle to Austin. And so I was in Seattle. Winters were a bit gray. It's a little too misty and wet there. The company I worked for at the time was all distributed. So I had the privilege of being able to work from anywhere in the United States as long as it had good Wi-Fi. A friend in the company invited me to check out Austin. He said, it's a little gloomy in Seattle. Give Texas a try. So stayed with him in a January, and it was 70 degrees and sunny, and I thought, I'll give it a year. Within that year, I met my now wife, who's from Corpus Christi originally, but soon after we met, she told me that she was starting law school at St. Mary's School of Law in San Antonio. And so that's what brought us to the city. First year, we didn't know what to expect. It takes a little bit to get plugged into San Antonio, but by year 3, we were ready to settle in, buy a house, and call this our forever home.
What's your wife's name, Cory?
Annie Bright. And she's a professor of law now at St. Mary's, the school where she attended law.
Congratulations to Annie. And the two of you started your family here.
Well, technically, our first son was born in Boston, Massachusetts. So we took a brief hiatus there for my wife to pursue a master's degree. That's how our relationship has gone. We'll see where she wants to get her PhD. Maybe we'll leave. I don't know. But our first son was born in Boston. And then before he turned 1, we moved back to San Antonio. Our second son, who's now about to turn 1 this month, he was born in San Antonio, Texas. So we got an interesting mix of where our family comes from.
Well, that's terrific. What part of the city did you guys settle in?
So we are about 5 minutes north of St. Mary's University, convenience for her job, still inside the 410 loop. I think the neighborhood is technically called Ingram Hills, but I am surprised how many people pass through and are surprised that our neighborhood exists in the pocket that it does. It's kind of sort of like a ranchy-ish space, still very close in proximity to the city. And so people are a little bit surprised at the plot that we have so close to city center.
Yeah, I think that part of town really developed in the 1970s, and so it's not exactly mid-century, but there was a time, believe it or not, where 410 wasn't a completed loop,
Hmm.
and much later, 1604 was built. What led you to launch Ensemble Texas?
Well, I launched Ensemble Texas first because of the experience I had running a media organization before called Grow Ensemble. There's a connection of the name there.
That was
But
in Washington or Austin?
it's hard to say where I lived at that exact time. We've moved so much in the last a few years, but I believe I started that in Austin, moving into San Antonio. But the purpose of that was to be a company that wasn't grounded to any location, particularly because we were so transient at the time. So it was focused on various topics in sustainability, heavily in sustainability in business, which I have a book that I'm working on now about that topic. But the goal of that was to really understand and define what sustainability looked like in different industries, whether we're talking about coffee, chocolate, or textiles, whatever it may be. And so I amassed a whole litany of interviews, about 250 or so. And one of the interviews stuck with me in particular. So I always like to conclude the conversations asking the guests some sort of big question, kind of a big idea question. And that was, what's the one thing that someone listening in could do to potentially leave a positive impact on the world? What would you recommend? And an answer from an author and environmentalist by the name of Paul Hawken, wrote a really excellent book that kind of changed how I thought about climate, the environment. It's called Regeneration, How to End the Climate Crisis in One Generation. He used the phrase, find out where you live. And that really stuck with me, thinking about how little I tended to know about the places that I lived, despite spending my entire life there. And so this stuck with me for the years to follow, and it took me down a path of trying to learn more about the native plants in San Antonio. I've taken the master naturalist training here, and so I was kind of working with this seed of an idea, having some philosophical direction, and using my experience that I gained in media there with Grow Ensemble. I decided to wind that project down and start something with a very localized focus to San Antonio. Help myself, one, very self-interested pursuit in one way to better understand the city that I live in hopes to better serve it, to better protect it and care for it. But likewise, help facilitate that process for other people, both new, like I was, and folks who have been here for some time who maybe might benefit from a little bit of extra awe and inspiration by learning something new about a city that they can feel so comfortable in. So that's why I started Ensemble Texas, which I started last year about at the midpoint, 2024.
So how many episodes are you in?
Just about 6 so far. So I started it with a little bit of an idea that I would sample what kind of format it might turn out to be, something like studio interviews like we're doing here, or on-site, kind of on-the-ground interviews. And so I've done a few good stories that way, figured out what's maybe too much work for one person to handle, and what seems most sustainable in the sweet spot of my skills and strengths. And so I'll be launching that now, or relaunching that in a way as a weekly podcast to come. I publish a twice weekly newsletter as well. But yeah, that was kind of our first season, if you can call it that.
Well, I think it's a good newsletter, and frankly, it's motivated me. We're going to talk about some changes here at Big City Small Town that you're going to bring to the table, and one of them is I'm going to finally launch my long overdue newsletter after 40 years of daily journalism and writing columns. I've kind of taken a 2-year hiatus from regular weekly deadline writing beyond the podcast, but it's time to get back into it, and I've enjoyed your newsletters. Why do you have 2? And I know why, but they're different. But I want you to tell listeners and tell people, if they want to go back and see what you've done on Ensemble Texas, where do they find that? And if they would like to sample your newsletter, how do they sign up?
Sure. So first and foremost, tactically, ensembletexas.com is going to be the place for that. If you aren't signed up for the newsletter already, the first screen that you'll get right there is an easy prompt to sign up for that. You'll start to receive an introduction email from myself, and that'll explain what kind of content you should expect to come. But the two newsletters, we got one on Tuesday, one on Thursday. The Tuesday newsletter is more of a long form feature. And, I like to think of this a little bit like an editorial style to try and see how I can understand myself, what's happening in San Antonio as the city changes and grows so fast in such interesting ways. But likewise, maybe share new thoughts and ideas or perspectives as to how we can think about how that growth happens. maybe what's best for San Antonio, even exploring, what best might look like for San Antonio. And so that's a long form feature. And so that's definitely a bit different. The Thursday email is more of a specialized curation of events and things to do in the city. And so I like to think about this as a very easy way to get people more connected to San Antonio. And that's by attending, local cultural events or art openings or, concerts, whatever it might be, or recommendations for hikes or specific things to do depending on the time of year. I think that's a really kind of easy entryway to make sure that people are getting out and understanding San Antonio, its, natural landscape as well as cultural landscape, supporting small businesses. And so it's just a quick, or not a quick list. This can be pretty lengthy, but it's packed with a lot of good information to plan your weekend, plan your next week, whatever it might be. So 2 very different emails, but I think they serve a similar purposes.
What's your goal in terms of frequency of podcast episodes?
Yeah, I plan for it to be a weekly show.
Okay. Yeah. This year in 2025?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be a very busy guy between us and your own podcast. Let's talk a little bit about some of the changes that are going to occur here at Big City Small Town, which some were bubbling up, but others you've brought with you. So the first one that I want to share with listeners is I'm going to take my weekly commentary, which I call The Last Word, and separate that from our Friday release of a weekly episode, interview with a guest, conversation with a guest like we're doing today. That will now drop on Saturday mornings. That will mean that you can get in and out of the Friday podcasts a little bit more quickly. I think we're going to try to edit that down to closer to a half an hour rather than 45 minutes, and people are busy. And then a very short Last Word episode every Saturday. And then I will release the newsletter every Monday. And the newsletter will give me an opportunity, Cory, to do something that I literally did for decades every week in this city, which is it'll give me the opportunity to share timely commentary on news developments and my own views and observations about the city, its leadership in all spheres, government, business, culture, nonprofits, just whatever's on my mind I'd like to share with our listeners. So you can go to bigcitysmalltown.com and you can find our 87 episodes now archived there. We'll be hitting 100 here before too long in the new year. And also you can sign up for the newsletter. It's free. There's no spam. We won't share your email with anybody. And I look forward to doing that with you starting this Monday, January 13th. So news there. And you're going to help me with guest bookings. And obviously our setup here is different than what regular listeners are used to. You can see some bare wall back here. I'm hoping to start showcasing some San Antonio artists and their work behind us with each podcast episode. We'll see if our friends at Geekdom will let me do that. And we like having artists on the podcast every so often and supporting their work. And those episodes always seem to do well. And now we'll bring a little work into the studio. Our listeners are pretty familiar, Cory, with my views on life and work in San Antonio, but you're new to many of the people watching the podcast or listening to it. And I'm just curious, as somebody 8 years in the city, so you're pretty rooted, but you also have that fresh eye perspective that someone like I don't have. What are your views of San Antonio right now, and both the good and bad about the city? You've lived on the West Coast, you've lived in Austin, you've lived in Boston, so you have a lot of perspective of life in other, very attractive cities. Seattle, I would add Spokane to that. I have relatives that live there, and then Boston, where I have a brother that lives there. I love Boston, except this time of year. What are your thoughts about San Antonio and its trajectory?
Well, first off, I think that it's very exciting. It's really interesting at a baseline to be in a city at a moment like this, to see how fast things are changing, even in the span of 8 years, which can seem like a decent amount of time to root yourself in some place, but in the span of how long people have been working on many of the initiatives, projects, and developments in San Antonio that are really coming into fruition now, might seem like a little slice of time, but it's very exciting. You can't stop seeing the city build in all different places, whether that's announcing new parks, new housing developments or expansions to the Pearl Hemisphere, new, public spaces. And so overall, I love it. It's a great place to be. And at the same time, I am just so interested in how growth can change a city. And I'm of the belief that not all growth is good growth. I think growth is worth being excited about, but I think that the level of awareness and consciousness that we have to it is really important. So a couple of those examples, Seattle, for one, was a city that was dramatically changed by the growth trajectory of Amazon. And I think in many ways that maybe diluted what people thought was the exact culture or unique identity, the grunge culture that Seattle originally had, because Kurt Cobain, Nirvana and everything, and Jimi Hendrix, this kind of storied music history. It doesn't look the exact same way today as Amazon's growth has taken place, brought in, many engineers from all over the world earning maybe 125, 150,000, 200,000 in some scenarios. It changes the makeup of a city. And likewise, Austin, too, a city that even in the year that I was there, I felt like it moved so fast. And likewise, now, Austin, a city with a very funky culture, mixed now with this kind of ultra modern tech scene. Again, a lot of people will say, man, Austin, you should have been here 10 years ago. And I feel like we've heard that whole, refrain again and again. Boston's a different city that's kind of existed in the United States since the start of the United States. So I feel like it's had a much kind of a stronger ground in its identity. And so I kind of feel like a student of this growth. And I'm interested to see, where that heads for San Antonio. And so I want to see it, happen in such a way to where we're still, very excited about what San Antonio is on the other side of that growth. Spokane, for example, an overflow city from Seattle, I might not be able to afford a home in the hometown that I grew up in. And so I have a 3-year-old, a 1-year-old right now. I'm hoping that in 2 decades, San Antonio is still a city that they love, not just me and my wife, but it's also a city that I hope that they want to live in, because that's my selfish goal. I want them to stick around ultimately. So there's considerations on that. How does the city develop? Of course, it's going to develop, and I think there's a lot of exciting ways it's doing so. But I just want to be mindful of that growth. How it's happening. I think there's a big story around AT&T historically, in our downtown and then pulling out. It's like, how does San Antonio invest and build a community that's strong and resilient? Of course, inviting to various partners like that, but not so that if someone moves or leaves, that the city is then, its core downtown is devastated for years to come. So those are things that I'm interested in thinking about as the city changes so rapidly.
It's interesting. The cities that you named, Boston, Seattle, and Austin, have some of the highest college education attainment levels of any major cities in the United States. San Antonio, just the opposite end of the spectrum. And that's our challenge, is we have a very high poverty rate in our city. It's persistent. It's multi-generational. It's largely focused on, the city's considerable Latino population, which is about 60% or more. We have a relatively small Black or African-American population, about 7% of the city. But those groups clearly do not share in the prosperity that San Antonio has seen at the same level that the white population has enjoyed. And, your wife works at one of the multiple institutions of higher learning here, three Catholic universities alone. Texas A&M San Antonio is the newcomer, growing very fast. UTSA is one of the biggest universities now in the state, and what it's doing downtown is very exciting. But we have something of a political standoff and culture war between the state's Republican leaders and the big city mayors. One result of that has been Governor Abbott and his allies have been starving the public school districts. Vetoed a $4.5 billion public school funding bill last legislative session in 2023, when legislators failed to give the governor his school voucher bill. And we're opening up now 1 week from Monday, January 13th, with the 89th legislative session. And all eyes will be on legislators. They had a $34 billion windfall in 2023. Oftentimes that turns out in the next session to be a budget shortfall. But in fact, we're going to have another multi-billion-dollar windfall, probably 20 to 25 billion. And we now have 20 billion or so, or heading toward that, in our rainy day fund. And by law, that has to be drawn down when it reaches that level. So there's a lot of money out there to invest in the cities if we can get state legislators to focus on public education, the housing crisis, the great need for water conservation and management projects, and of course, in this frigid weather that we're facing, strengthening our very vulnerable energy grid. So there's going to be a lot in 2025. Fast forward to January 20th, we've got the inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th president, and that will be a peaceful transition. He'll take the oath of office with President Biden sitting there. President Biden took his oath of office, and not only was Trump not sitting there, but it was after the January 6th riots where we've had nearly 1,000 people criminally prosecuted for insurrection and rioting and attacking Capitol Police. It's going to be a much quieter ceremony in Washington. But then what happens next is on everybody's mind. Will there really be mass deportations? And if so, it looks to me like San Antonio and South Texas might be ground zero of an effort like that. And I don't know what that means in terms of detaining people, putting them in camps, finding countries that will take them. I just don't have any idea how that can work. And frankly, I don't think it will work. But we're going to be watching that. We've got the legislative session. And closer to home here in San Antonio, we have a mayoral election. I've lost count, but I think there's about 16 people that have indicated they're going to be on the ballot. Probably 10 of those will not run serious campaigns or raise money. But even so, if we have a half a dozen credible candidates, which probably will include at least 3 sitting council members, and 1 former council member, it's going to be a very competitive race, and probably the May vote will take us into a June runoff. So there's going to be a lot of news in 2025.
Mm-hmm. Well, and all the reason more for me to feel very grounded and connected to your sense of community. And, the national narrative can be a little bit difficult to decipher and make sense of and what's going to happen. And so I think that both with, a lot of the opportunity that San Antonio faces and maybe some potential challenge, I think it's more important than ever that, we feel very grounded in a localized sense.
Well, Cory Ames, welcome again to Big City, Small Town. And for our listeners that aren't familiar with Ensemble Texas and your work there, tell them how to find it and how to sign up for your newsletter again.
Yeah. Again, head to ensembletexas.com to do so. That's the best place to get signed up for the newsletter. Myself, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so you can get connected with me there. I'll be looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, that concludes this episode of Big City, Small Town. Thank you for watching or listening or both. Please do sign up for the new newsletter, which launches this Monday, January 13th. You can go to bigcitysmalltown.com. And as I said, just put your email in there and we won't share that with anybody. You won't get any spam. And every Monday you can look forward to that newsletter. And thanks again to our sponsors, Weston Urban, building the city our children want to call home. And here at Geekdom, our sponsor, where startups are born. It's a great place for creatives of all ages to become members and get to work, turning your idea into a real business. Thanks to our producer, Cory Ames, Maura Bobbitt, our in-studio production, Erica Rempel for video and social media, and Alfie De La Garza of Sound Crane Studio. We'll see you all next week.